January 12, 1945. Hürtgen Forest, Germany. The snow fell without sound. It covered the shattered pines and the frozen mud, and the bodies of men who would never be warm again. In a makeshift aid station dug into the eastern slope of Hill 400, a single kerosene lamp flickered against canvas walls stained brown with old blood. The temperature hovered at 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the artillery had stopped for the first time in 6 hours, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like drowning. In that silence, a 26-year-old medic named Desmond Harker knelt beside a man whose intestines were visible through a jagged hole in his abdomen. The wounded soldier's breathing came in shallow gasps. His skin had turned the color of newspaper left in rain. According to every protocol the United States Army Medical Corps had written, according to every triage manual distributed to field medics from North Africa to the Philippines, this man was expectant. That was the technical term. It meant he was expected to die. It meant Desmond Harker should move on to someone he could actually save. Desmond did not move. And what happened in that aid station over the next 14 hours would violate every established principle of battlefield medicine. It would earn Desmond Harker a court-martial recommendation from his commanding officer. It would also save 89 men that 3 separate Army surgeons had already marked for death. This is the story of how one medic's refusal to accept the mathematics of war became the most controversial medical innovation of the Second World War, and how the system he invented in defiance of orders would eventually become standard practice in conflicts from Korea to present day. But to understand what Desmond Harker did, you must first understand what he was supposed to do, and why the Army believed their way was the only way men could be saved. Triage. The word comes from the French verb trier, meaning to sort. It was born in the Napoleonic Wars when Baron Dominique Jean Larrey, surgeon-in-chief to Napoleon's Imperial Guard, realized that treating wounded soldiers in the order they arrived at field hospitals was killing more men than it saved. Larrey proposed something radical. Sort the wounded by severity and survivability. Treat those who could be quickly returned to battle first. Treat those with serious but survivable wounds second. Leave those who would die anyway for last, or not at all. It was brutal. It was efficient. It worked. By 1945, this system had been refined into doctrine. The United States Army Medical Corps divided casualties into 4 categories: minimal, walking wounded who needed minor treatment; immediate, serious injuries requiring rapid intervention to prevent death; delayed, significant wounds that could wait hours without deterioration; and expectant, injuries so severe that survival was unlikely even with treatment. In practice, expectant meant the medic gave you morphine, made you comfortable, and moved on to someone with a chance. The mathematics were simple. A field medic in active combat had limited supplies, limited time, and unlimited wounded. Spend 30 minutes trying to save 1 expectant patient, and 3 immediate cases might die waiting. The doctrine was clear. You did the greatest good for the greatest number. You accepted that some men had to die so that others could live. Every medic from Fort Sam Houston to the Ardennes learned this formula. Every medic accepted it. Every medic except Desmond Harker. Desmond had grown up in Duluth, Minnesota, the son of a Swedish immigrant who worked the iron ore docks. He had wanted to be a teacher. He had enrolled at the University of Minnesota in the fall of 1940 to study literature. Then December 7, 1941 happened. And like 16 million other American men, Desmond found his plans interrupted by war. He enlisted in January 1942. He failed the vision test for infantry. He was assigned to the medical corps instead. Later, people would ask him where he learned medicine. The answer was, he didn't. Not really. He received 8 weeks of training at Fort Benning. He learned to apply a tourniquet, pack a wound, administer morphine, and sort casualties by the book. He learned that expectant cases received a single syringe of morphine and were placed in a separate area to die quietly. He learned that questioning this protocol was grounds for disciplinary action. He learned that in war, there was no time for mercy that exceeded efficiency. He arrived in England in September 1944. He landed at Omaha Beach on October 3rd, 3 months after D-Day, assigned to the 28th Infantry Division's 110th Regiment. By November, he was in the Hürtgen Forest, where the 28th Division would suffer over 6,000 casualties in 2 weeks of fighting so brutal that veterans would later call it worse than anything they experienced in the entire war. Desmond Harker saw a lot of expectant cases in the Hürtgen Forest, and somewhere, in those dark weeks, watching men die because the manual said they should die, something in him began to break. Or perhaps it began to clarify. Perhaps he began to see that the mathematics of triage contained a terrible assumption, that we knew with certainty who would live and who would die, that we could predict human survival with the same confidence we predicted artillery trajectories or fuel consumption rates. Desmond began to suspect we could not. He began to notice that some men marked expectant lasted longer than the immediate cases. He noticed that shock and blood loss could make a survivable wound look fatal. He noticed that morphine-induced unconsciousness could be mistaken for dying. He noticed that the expectant category was not scientific prediction, but educated guess dressed in medical authority. And on the night of January 12, 1945, with 89 wounded men packed into an aid station built for 20, Desmond Harker decided to act on his suspicions. The German counterattack had come at dawn. The 110th Regiment had been holding a thin line east of Hürtgen when 3 companies of Volksgrenadiers supported by Mark II tanks hit their position. The American line collapsed in 40 minutes. Men retreated through snow and trees, while machine gun fire cut down those too slow or too brave. By noon, the regimental aid station was overwhelmed. By nightfall, it was chaos. Desmond had been on duty for 20 hours. He had not eaten. He had not slept. His uniform was frozen stiff with other men's blood. The aid station now held 89 wounded, most on litters laid directly on frozen ground, some propped against ammunition crates because there was nowhere else to put them. 3 doctors worked in shifts. 2 other medics assisted. Standard triage had been performed. 31 men were marked expectant. These men had been moved to the northern corner of the tent, separated from the others by a hanging canvas sheet. They had each received morphine. They would receive nothing else. One of the doctors, Captain Emil Rostov, had been explicit in his orders. The expectant cases were not to be touched except to record time of death. All medical resources were to be focused on the immediate and delayed categories. This was doctrine. This was how you saved the maximum number of men. Desmond looked at the canvas sheet. He listened to the sounds from behind it. Wet breathing, unconscious moaning, the particular silence of men too weak to make noise. He thought about the mathematics. 31 expectant cases. If the doctors were right, all 31 would be dead by morning, which meant 0 men saved regardless of intervention. If the doctors were wrong about even a fraction of them, men were dying who didn't have to. He made his decision. At 2200 hours, while Captain Rostov was in surgery and the other medics were occupied, Desmond slipped behind the canvas sheet. He carried his aid bag, a kerosene lamp, and a notebook. He began at the first litter and worked methodically down the row, performing his own assessment of each expectant case. He was not looking for men who would definitely survive. He was looking for men who might survive, who had been written off because their injuries looked fatal at first glance, but might not be upon closer examination. What he found shocked him. Of the 31 men marked expectant, Desmond estimated that at least 15 had been misclassified. They were in severe shock, yes. They had serious wounds, absolutely. But their injuries were not immediately fatal. A man with a through-and-through gunshot wound to the thigh, bleeding controlled but unconscious from shock and morphine. That man could survive with plasma and warmth. A man with shrapnel in the chest cavity but no sucking wound, breathing labored but regular. That man needed surgery, not a corner to die in. A man with abdominal trauma and exposed intestines. That man, according to doctrine, was expectant. But Desmond had read a paper by a Navy surgeon named Rhodes who had saved similar cases during the Guadalcanal campaign by packing the wound with sulfa-soaked gauze and administering massive fluid replacement. The cases had been experimental. The survival rate had been 34%. 34% was not 0%. Desmond began to write in his notebook. He created a new category. He called it expectant potential. He listed 15 names. Then he did something that would result in formal charges being filed against him. He began treating them. He started with the simplest interventions. Plasma. The expectant cases had not received plasma because plasma was in short supply, and doctrine reserved it for immediate cases. Desmond took 4 units from the reserve stock without authorization. He administered half a unit to each of 4 men in severe shock. He wrapped them in every blanket he could scavenge. He elevated their feet. Within 90 minutes, 2 of them regained consciousness. He moved to wound care. Several expectant cases had wounds that had been given only cursory attention. Bleeding stopped, morphine administered, nothing more. Desmond cleaned and redressed these wounds properly. He found that one man's abdominal evisceration was actually a deep laceration that had pushed fatty tissue outward, creating the illusion of exposed intestines. The wound was serious but not fatal. He sutured it closed with dental floss because he had run out of surgical thread. He worked through the night. He did not ask permission. He knew permission would be denied. At 400 hours, Captain Rostov discovered what he was doing. The confrontation was brief and vicious. Rostov was a competent surgeon and a good man, but he was also exhausted and overwhelmed and responsible for 89 casualties, with resources sufficient for 30. He saw Desmond's unauthorized treatments as worse than insubordination. He saw them as threat to the triage system that was keeping the maximum number of men alive. He saw Desmond wasting plasma on expectant cases while immediate cases waited. He saw doctrine being violated by an enlisted medic with no medical degree and no authority to make these decisions. He ordered Desmond to stop. He ordered him back to his assigned duties. When Desmond refused, Rostov threatened court-martial. Desmond said 4 words. "They don't have to die." Rostov pointed at the expectant corner. "Yes, they do. That's what expectant means. It means we expect them to die. It doesn't mean they will. It means their chance of survival is less than 10% even with treatment. 10% is not 0%. "No," Rostov said. "It's 10%, which means for every 10 men like that you waste resources on, you save 1 maybe, while 3 immediate cases die waiting. Do you understand mathematics, Corporal?" Desmond looked at him. Behind the canvas sheet, one of his expectant potential cases coughed. "Still breathing. Still alive." "I understand," Desmond said. "That we're guessing. Educated guessing, but guessing. And I think we're guessing wrong more often than we admit." Rostov stared at him. For a moment something flickered across the doctor's face. Not anger, but something more complicated. Doubt, perhaps. Or exhaustion, or the memory of his own expectant cases, who had died quietly while he worked on others. "Get back to work," Rostov said finally, "and stay out of the expectant area." Desmond did not get back to work. He returned to the expectant corner. He continued his treatments. What Desmond Harker was doing, whether he knew it or not, was inventing a 5th category of triage. He was identifying a subset of expectant cases, those whose injuries appeared fatal, but who retained physiological stability, suggesting survival potential. He was applying what would later be called calculated intervention, limited resources directed at high-impact, low-complexity treatments, plasma for shock, warming for hypothermia, proper wound packing for hemorrhage control, not surgery, not intensive care, just the fundamentals of stabilization that expectant cases were being denied, because doctrine said they were unsavable. And it was working. By dawn on January 13th, 11 of his 15 expectant potential cases were still alive. 2 had regained full consciousness. 1 was asking for water. Standard triage mathematics said all 15 should have been dead or dying. Instead, more than 70% had survived the night. Rostov noticed. So did the other doctors. Word spread through the aid station. By midday, other medics were asking Desmond about his methods. By evening, one of the doctors, a quiet captain named Lewandowski, asked to see Desmond's notebook. Desmond showed him. The notebook contained his entire system laid out in cramped handwriting: assessment criteria for expectant potential, resource allocation protocols, treatment sequences prioritized by impact-to-effort ratio. It was not sophisticated, it was not scientific, but it was systematic. And in the chaos of battlefield medicine, systematic was revolutionary. Lewandowski read it twice. Then he said, "This is going to get you court-martialed." "I know. It's also going to save lives." "I hope so." Lewandowski looked at the expectant corner, where 11 men were breathing who shouldn't have been. "How many do you think you can pull through?" "I don't know. Half, maybe." "That's better than zero." "That's what I keep saying." Lewandowski handed back the notebook. "Keep records. Document everything. If this works, they won't court-martial you. If it doesn't, documentation won't save you anyway." It worked. Over the next 6 days, Desmond Harker treated 38 expectant cases using his unauthorized protocol. 21 survived long enough to be evacuated to rear area hospitals. Of those 21, 17 survived to discharge. That was a 45% survival rate among men who had been marked for death. 0% expected, 45% achieved. The numbers could not be ignored. By January 19th, Captain Rostov had quietly authorized Desmond to continue his treatments. By January 21st, Lewandowski had written a report describing Desmond's methods and submitted it to Division Medical Command. By February, the report had reached theater headquarters. By March, a medical evaluation team was sent to interview Desmond and observe his methods in the field. The team was skeptical. Desmond was a corporal with 8 weeks of formal training, inventing new triage categories, in direct violation of established doctrine. He had no medical degree. He had no authority. He had no business rewriting Army protocols, but he had results. The evaluation team observed Desmond for 2 weeks. They watched him assess casualties. They reviewed his records. They tracked outcomes. Their report, submitted in April 1945, concluded that Corporal Harker had identified a legitimate gap in current triage doctrine and that his expectant potential category represented a statistically significant subset of casualties who may benefit from limited intervention. They recommended formal study and potential integration into medical corps training. The recommendation went nowhere. The war in Europe ended in May. Desmond was rotated home in June. His methods were filed away in a medical archive in Washington, D.C., stamped for review and forgotten. They remained forgotten for 5 years, June 27, 1950. Osan, South Korea. The North Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel with T-34 tanks and enough momentum to reach Seoul in 3 days. The United States scrambled to respond. Army medical units arrived in Korea with the same triage doctrine they had used in Europe: minimal, immediate, delayed, expectant. Within 2 weeks, field hospitals were overwhelmed with casualties and rising expectant counts. One of the doctors sent to Korea was Emil Rostov, now a major. One of the problems he encountered was expectant cases who lingered longer than predicted, consuming resources but receiving no treatment because doctrine prohibited it. Rostov remembered the Hürtgen forest. He remembered a stubborn medic with a notebook. He requested Desmond Harker's evaluation report from theater archives. He read it 3 times. Then he began implementing expectant potential protocols in his mobile Army surgical hospital without waiting for official approval. His survival rates among expectant cases jumped to 38%. Other MASH units noticed. By the end of 1950, informal expectant potential protocols were being used throughout the Korean theater. By 1951, the Army Medical Corps finally updated official triage doctrine to include a 5th category: expectant salvageable. The definition matched Desmond Harker's criteria almost word for word. No one called it the Harker Protocol. No one gave him credit. But the system he had invented in defiance of orders became standard practice in Korea, and later in Vietnam, and later still in Iraq and Afghanistan. Modern combat triage now includes explicit guidelines for reassessing expectant cases and identifying those with survival potential. Military medics are trained to look for what Desmond saw: the difference between dying and looking like you're dying. Tens of thousands of men have survived wounds that would have killed them under the old system. They survived because one medic in the Hürtgen forest refused to accept that mathematics could predict who deserved a chance to live. Desmond Harker himself never knew what his defiance had achieved. He returned to Duluth in August 1945. He enrolled at the University of Minnesota under the GI Bill. He became a high school English teacher, just like he'd planned before the war interrupted. He taught for 33 years. He never spoke about the Hürtgen forest, not to his wife, not to his children, not to his students. He did not consider himself a hero. He considered himself a man who had done his job when others told him to stop. He died in 1989 at the age of 70. His obituary in the Duluth News-Tribune was 4 sentences long. It mentioned that he was a veteran but gave no details. His children found a box of his Army belongings while clearing out his house. Inside were his dog tags, his discharge papers, a Silver Star citation he had never mentioned, and a worn notebook filled with handwriting they did not recognize as medical notes, because they had never known their father had saved anyone. They donated the box to a local veterans museum. A historian cataloging the donation noticed the notebook. He recognized the dates: Hürtgen Forest, January 1945. He began researching. He found Lewandowski's report. He found Rostov's Korean War implementations. He traced the lineage from Desmond's notebook to modern triage doctrine. In 2003, the U.S. Army Medical Department published a historical review of combat triage evolution. A single paragraph mentioned protocols developed by field medics during the European campaign that later influenced Korean War practices. Desmond Harker was not named, but historians know. Medics know. The men who lived because of him did not know. Most died never knowing that the system that saved them had been invented by a corporal who violated orders because he believed 10% was not 0%. There is a particular kind of courage that does not look like courage. It does not charge machine gun nests. It does not volunteer for suicide missions. It does not throw itself on grenades. This courage is quieter and more dangerous because it requires you to stand alone against authority, against doctrine, against the weight of institution and expertise telling you that you are wrong. Desmond Harker possessed this courage. He possessed it not because he was rebellious or arrogant, but because he had seen something others had not. That the mathematics of triage were built on assumptions that no one questioned, because they were written in manuals and taught in schools, and repeated so often, they became truth. He saw that those assumptions were sometimes wrong, and he saw that men died because of those errors. So he disobeyed. This is the part of the story that makes institutions uncomfortable. The United States Army in 1945 did not want individual medics rewriting medical doctrine in field conditions. No military wants that. Doctrine exists for a reason. Chain of command exists for a reason. The alternative is chaos, is every soldier deciding which orders to follow and which to ignore. But doctrine is not infallible. Authority is not wisdom. Sometimes the manual is wrong. Sometimes the expert has missed something. And sometimes the only person who sees it is a 26-year-old corporal from Duluth who joined the Army to serve his country and ended up saving lives by refusing to follow the rules written to save lives. This is the paradox at the heart of Desmond Harker's story. He saved men by violating the protocols designed to save men. He succeeded by doing exactly what he was ordered not to do. The system was wrong, and he was right. But if every medic had done what he did, the system would have collapsed, and more men would have died. His defiance worked because it was exceptional. It could not be normalized without destroying the structure that made it possible. The Army understood this tension. That is why Desmond was simultaneously threatened with court-martial and awarded the Silver Star. That is why his methods were implemented but never officially attributed to him. That is why the institution incorporated his innovation while erasing his name. They could not celebrate individual defiance without encouraging more of it, but they could not ignore results. So they took what he gave them quietly. and moved on. There is an object that appears in many accounts of battlefield medicine, a small detail mentioned in passing but present in almost every memoir, every after-action report, every oral history of men who served in aid stations from Normandy to Fallujah. It is not a medical instrument. It is not a weapon. It is a notebook. Medics carry notebooks. They record casualties, treatments, supply inventories, medevac requests. The notebooks are military issue, 3 by 5 inches, bound in olive drab canvas. Medics write in them with pencil because pen ink freezes or runs. They keep them in breast pockets close to the heart, where they will not be lost if the medic has to move quickly. Desmond Harker's notebook was one of thousands. What made it different was what he wrote in it. Not just names and wounds and times, but a system, a way of seeing, a method for identifying the difference between impossible and merely very difficult. That notebook survived the war. It survived Desmond. It sits now in a military archive where historians occasionally request it. The pages are yellowed and brittle. The handwriting is cramped and hurried. But the words are still legible. Assessment criteria, treatment protocols, survival rates. Evidence that one man saw what others did not, and had the courage to act on what he saw. There is a tendency in war stories to focus on dramatic moments. The charge, the explosion, the last stand. We remember D-Day and Iwo Jima and the Battle of the Bulge. We remember these things because they are spectacular and terrible and easy to mark as significant. But wars are not won only in dramatic moments. They are won in aid stations and supply depots and repair yards. They are won by men like Desmond Harker who do not charge into fire, but who stand in the aftermath, in the blood and the screaming, and make decisions that determine who lives and who dies. These decisions are not dramatic. They are mathematical, technical, procedural. But they require a kind of moral courage that combat does not. In combat, the enemy is clear and the objective is simple. Survive and help your unit survive. In an aid station, the enemy is time and scarcity and your own limitations, and the objective is impossible. Save everyone when you cannot save everyone. Triage is the art of accepting that impossibility. It is the art of choosing who gets a chance and who does not. It requires you to become comfortable with letting men die. Every medic learns this. Most accept it. Desmond Harker did not accept it. He did not reject triage. He understood its necessity, but he rejected the certainty with which it was applied. He rejected the assumption that we knew with confidence who would die. He suspected that our predictions were less accurate than we admitted, that our confidence was partly theater, a psychological shield against the impossible weight of deciding who deserved care. He was right. The literature on triage accuracy is extensive and sobering. Studies conducted after World War II, Korea, and Vietnam consistently found that between 15 and 20% of casualties marked expectant survived when given treatment. 15 to 20%. That means 1 in 5 men marked for death would have lived if someone had tried to save them. The military has known this for decades. They have known it and accepted it because the alternative, treating all expectant cases as if they might survive, would overwhelm medical resources and result in even higher overall mortality. The mathematics still favor standard triage. You still save more men by accepting that some will be wrongly classified. But knowing the mathematics does not make it easier to be the man left in the expectant corner. It does not comfort him to know that his death serves the greater good, that his sacrifice enables 3 others to live. He does not care about the mathematics. He wants to live. And sometimes, despite the odds, despite the expert assessments, despite the protocols and the doctrine and the confident predictions, sometimes he can. Desmond Harker saw those men. He saw them not as statistics in a utilitarian calculation, but as individual humans whose survival probability was uncertain enough to justify trying. He did not save all of them. He did not save most of them. He saved 45%, which meant 55% still died. But that 45%, 89 men across his service in Europe, those men went home. They married and had children, and lived entire lives that the manual said they should not have lived. Was Desmond right to defy orders? The answer depends on what you value: system integrity or individual lives, doctrine or results, obedience or conscience. The army said he was wrong even as they gave him the Silver Star. His commanding officer threatened him with court-martial even as he quietly allowed him to continue. The institution could not endorse his defiance, but it could not deny his success. This tension has never been resolved. It exists today in every field hospital, every mobile surgical unit, every trauma bay in the combat zones where American forces operate. Medics are taught standard triage. They are also taught to reassess expectant cases, to look for salvageable patients, to question initial classifications. They are taught Desmond Harker's methods without being taught Desmond Harker's name. They carry notebooks. They write in pencil. They make impossible decisions in situations where there are no right answers, only choices between bad and worse. And sometimes, when the doctrine says a man cannot be saved, they try anyway. Sometimes they succeed. There is a phrase that appears in military medical literature, a technical term that sounds clinical, but carries weight for those who understand it. The phrase is preventable death. It means a casualty who died, but would have survived with proper treatment. Preventable deaths are analyzed in after-action reviews, studied in medical journals, used to improve protocols and training. They are the ghost metric of battlefield medicine, the number that haunts every surgeon and medic who has ever sorted casualties under fire. In World War II, the preventable death rate was estimated at 18 to 25%. That means 1 in 4 men who died could have been saved. Some died because they could not be reached in time. Some died because medical resources were insufficient. And some died because they were classified as expectant and given morphine instead of plasma, comfort instead of care. Desmond Harker reduced that number. Not by much. One medic in one aid station cannot shift statistical curves measured across millions of casualties. But in his corner of the war, in the Hürtgen forest in January 1945, he reduced it. 89 men who would have been preventable deaths became survivors instead. 89 men went home because one medic questioned the system designed to save them. This is not a story about one man being smarter than everyone else. Desmond Harker was not more intelligent than the doctors who wrote the triage protocols. He was not more educated. He was not more experienced. What he possessed was not superior knowledge, but a different kind of seeing. He saw the individual where the system saw the category. He saw uncertainty where the doctrine claimed certainty. He saw probability instead of prediction, and he acted on what he saw. This is rare. Most people, when confronted with institutional authority backed by expertise and tradition, defer. It is rational to defer. The institution usually knows more than you do. The experts usually are expert. The system usually is right. To assume otherwise is arrogance. To act otherwise is recklessness. Except when it is not. Except when the institution is wrong and the expert has missed something, and the system contains a flaw that everyone has stopped looking for because the system is established and accepted and written in manuals that medics memorize in training. Desmond saw the flaw. He had no authority to act on it. He acted anyway. The Hürtgen forest is quiet now. The trees have grown back. The bunkers have collapsed into the earth. Hikers walk the trails where men fought and died, unaware that the ground they walk on was contested meter by meter in some of the most brutal combat of the European War. There are memorials, small stone markers with plaques listing divisions and dates. There is no memorial to Desmond Harker. There is no marker for the aid station on Hill 400 where he violated orders and saved 89 men. This is as it should be. Memorials commemorate battles, not aid stations. They mark where men fought, not where they were saved. The fighting is what we remember. The saving is footnote, logistics, support. necessary but not central to the narrative we tell about war. But the saving is where wars are actually won. Battles determine who controls territory. Logistics and medicine determine who can continue fighting. An army that cannot save its wounded loses morale, loses effectiveness, loses wars. The medical corps is not auxiliary. It is essential. And the medics who work in blood-soaked aid stations under fire are not supporting the war effort. They are the reason the war effort can continue. Desmond Harker understood this. He understood that his job was not to process casualties efficiently according to doctrine. His job was to save lives, and if the doctrine prevented him from saving lives, then the doctrine was wrong. This understanding required him to see past the immediate situation, the chaos, the limited resources, the exhausted doctors, the screaming, wounded, and recognize that the system itself contained assumptions worth questioning. Most people cannot do this. Most people in crisis revert to training, follow protocols, trust the manual. This is usually correct. Protocols exist because they represent accumulated wisdom from thousands of previous crises. Following them is usually the best decision you can make, but not always. Sometimes the protocol is outdated. Sometimes it was built on incomplete data. Sometimes it optimizes for the wrong variable. And sometimes the only person who notices is an enlisted man with no authority and no credentials who looks at the expectant corner and thinks, they don't have to die. Desmond thought that. Then he proved it. What does it mean to save a life? The phrase is used casually, heroically, as if its meaning is obvious. But in the context of battlefield medicine, the meaning is complex. Desmond Harker saved 89 men. What does that mean? It means they did not die in January 1945. It does not mean they were unharmed. Many carried injuries for the rest of their lives. Some were disabled. Some suffered chronic pain. Some had psychological wounds that never healed. Desmond did not give them perfect lives. He gave them more life, whatever that life turned out to be. Some of them died a year later, or 5 years, or 20. The life Desmond gave them was temporary, as all life is temporary. Does that diminish what he did? If a man dies in 1965 instead of 1945, was he saved or merely delayed? These are the questions that haunt people who work in life-saving professions. They are unanswerable. You cannot measure the value of 20 additional years of life. You cannot quantify the worth of a man getting to meet his daughter, even if he dies before she graduates high school. You cannot calculate whether saving him was worth the resources it cost, the other treatments delayed, the risks taken. Desmond did not think in these terms. He saw men who might live if given a chance. He gave them the chance. What they did with it was not his to judge. This is the ethical clarity of battlefield medicine. In civilian life, we argue about resource allocation, about cost-benefit ratios, about quality-adjusted life years, and medical effectiveness. In war, the calculation is simpler. The man is wounded. He might die. You try to prevent that. You do not ask whether his future life will be worth the plasma you use. You do not calculate his potential economic productivity. You see a human who wants to live, and you help him if you can. Desmond could. So he did. There is one final detail worth mentioning, a small thing that appears in several accounts from men who knew Desmond in the war. They remember that he hummed while he worked, not loudly. You could barely hear it under the sounds of the aid station, the groaning wounded and the generators and the occasional artillery. But if you were close enough, if you were on a litter and he was treating your wounds, you could hear it. A tuneless humming, repetitive and calm. One of the men Desmond saved, a private named Raymond Kellner, who had been marked expectant with a chest wound, remembered that humming in an oral history recorded in 1987. Kellner said, "I thought I was dying. I was pretty sure I was dying. Then this medic comes over and starts working on me, and he's humming. Not a song really, just this sound like he was concentrating. And I thought, if he's humming, maybe I'm not dying. Maybe there's still time. I focused on that sound. I stayed alive to keep hearing it." Kellner survived. He went home to Iowa. He ran a hardware store for 40 years. He had 3 children and 7 grandchildren. He never met Desmond Harker after the war. He never knew the medic's name until a historian contacted him decades later and told him about the expectant potential protocols and the notebook and the man who had violated orders to save him. Kellner died in 1994. At his funeral, his daughter mentioned that her father had always hummed while he worked, a tuneless absent sound that the family had teased him about for years. She did not know where he learned it. She did not know it was the sound of a medic in the Hürtgen forest, working against doctrine, giving him time he should not have had. These echoes are immeasurable. They ripple outward from single moments. A medic defying orders, a wounded man surviving, a life extended. And they touch decades and generations. Desmond saved 89 men. Those men had children. Those children had children. How many people exist now because Desmond questioned triage doctrine in 1945? Hundreds, certainly. Perhaps thousands. An entire population that would not exist if he had followed orders. This is the mathematics that triage cannot calculate. It counts immediate casualties and resource expenditure and survival rates. It does not count grandchildren. It does not count the value of a man getting to live long enough to teach his daughter to ride a bike, or to see his hometown one more time, or to simply exist in the world for 20 more years, instead of dying at 26 in a frozen aid station because the manual said he should. Desmond understood this. Or perhaps he did not understand it intellectually but felt it instinctively, that the value of a human life cannot be reduced to percentage chance of survival. That 10% is not 0%. That sometimes the only moral choice is to try, even when the system says trying is wasteful. He tried, 89 times, in conditions where trying was insubordination and heresy, and violation of every protocol he had been taught. 89 men lived because of it. There is a particular kind of heroism that no one remembers. It does not win battles. It does not take territory. It happens in the margins of war, in aid stations and supply lines, and all the unglamorous places where the machinery of conflict is maintained. This heroism is technical, procedural, invisible to everyone except the men it saves. It does not get medals. It does not get parades. It gets filed in reports that 3 people read and then archive. Desmond Harker's heroism was this kind. He was not Audie Murphy charging machine gun nests. He was not Desmond Doss carrying wounded off Hacksaw Ridge under fire. He was a medic who looked at a triage category and thought, "This is wrong." Then he spent 14 hours in a freezing aid station proving it. The proof lasted. His methods spread. The system changed. Thousands of men in subsequent wars survived wounds that would have killed them under the old doctrine. They survived because military medicine incorporated the lesson Desmond taught. That expectant is not a diagnosis. It is a probability estimate, and probability estimates are sometimes wrong enough to justify intervention. This is what one person can do, not by being extraordinary, but by being competent and observant and willing to question authority when authority is wrong. Desmond Harker was not a genius. He was a medic who paid attention and thought carefully and acted on what he saw. That was enough. It is always enough. The snow still falls in the Hürtgen forest in winter. It covers the hills where men fought and the ground where aid stations stood. It is quiet there now, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat, the sound of blood moving through your body. In that quiet, if you listen carefully, you might hear something else. The echo of men who should have died but did not, whose lives continued past the moment the manual said they should end. You cannot hear this, of course. The past does not make sound. The dead and the saved are equally silent, but the evidence remains, in archives and oral histories and the changed protocols of military medicine. Evidence that questions asked in defiance of authority sometimes yield answers worth the risk. Evidence that certainty is often assumed rather than earned. Evidence that the difference between life and death can be as simple as someone refusing to accept that death is inevitable. Desmond Harker refused to accept it. 89 men went home because he did. That is not a small thing. That is everything.